This is from Brian in Painville, Illinois. The Sheet Apparition and Other Stories. My story takes place in Herrin, Illinois. It's a town in southern Illinois that has a lot of history to it. There's even a book written about the Herrin Massacre called Bloody Williamson. I live right down the road where these atrocities took place. The neighborhood I grew up in is a country area that was originally known as Painville, but the town messed up the lettering for the street sign and spelled it P-A-I-N instead of P-A-Y-N-E. The street sign kept getting stolen, so they added an N after Pain. In this neighborhood, there have been a lot of strange things that have occurred during my life, so this story isn't limited to just me. My cousin hung himself down the street in his front yard. Another neighbor had a standoff with police and was shot 10 times by them a few years back. The house I grew up in was once a rental back in the early 1900s. Rumor passed down from my grandfather was that a teenager that worshipped the devil once set fire to the house. It had been remodeled since then. The only two things I remember my grandmother saying was that one time she felt a stab in her arm, like something had stabbed her with a fork, and found 3 holes in her arm, like a small pitchfork was driven into it. Also, a tiny brown creature once climbed up on a windowsill to peer in at her. My grandfather had heard strange screams once that came from the forest in the early morning. They sounded like a woman, yet louder than any woman could scream. All of the dogs were barking and had gone silent. When my mother was a child, they had no heating. They warmed themselves by a wood-burning stove. My mom and her sister would sometimes play with the Ouija board for fun. One night, my mother recalled having insomnia in the cold house. She heard heavy footsteps coming toward her bedroom. She thought it may have been her father, as he was a very tall-built man. A large, shadowy figure came into the doorway, lit by the moonlight, with a large head on its shoulders, shaped similar to that of a pumpkin. It stopped, and then proceeded to come closer to her bed. She pulled her blanket over her head, too afraid to scream. She then felt several tugs, and then it stopped, and left the room. Another time she said she was playing in the living room. There was an old television that was turned off at the far side of the room. While she was playing, the gleam of 2 eyes in the television caught her attention. My mother had worn glasses her entire life, and she began to think that maybe something was reflecting off the glasses and into the TV. So she slowly tilted her head one way and then the other. The glowing eyes didn't move. At first. Several seconds later, they tilted in the same manner that she had tilted her head. She fled the room in terror. Another story relates to when she was outside playing in the yard. Her parents were also outside doing various chores. It was a very large acre of land. Her father was somewhere tilling a small garden, and her mother was hanging up laundry. As she was playing, she noticed someone wearing a sheet in the road. The sheet had eyes cut out of it, like your classic homemade ghost costume. Except this couldn't have been a person, because it wasn't walking. Instead of taking stride as someone would who was walking, the sheet drifted close to the ground at a steady pace. She watched it drift all the way down the street, and then she ran to see where it had gone. Once she made it to the road, it was gone. She asked her parents if either of them had seen the apparition, but neither of them saw anything. My earliest memory in this house was about the age of 6. I had regular insomnia as a child, too. It was probably brought on by too many Tales from the Dark Side episodes. My bedroom was joined with my parents' room with a tall, wide, arched doorway. One night, around midnight, I had been tossing and turning for a long time, until I suddenly noticed a shadow become apparent, lit by the moon through a window that stood at the head of my parents' bed. It was what I later learned to be a shadow person as an adult. Its eyes glowed as it hovered right above my parents sleeping. I could tell it was staring down at both of them, and it hadn't noticed me yet. So I didn't make a sound, and I tried to remain as still as I could, hoping it wouldn't notice me. Unfortunately, it abruptly looked up at me like it sensed I was there and started floating toward me. I screamed as loud as I could. My parents both shot up out of bed and turned on the lights. The thing was gone. One other time, as my mom was tucking me into bed, I felt a disembodied hand under my blankets crawl back from behind my bed. I wanted to share that, even though it isn't much of a story, because another listener had a disembodied hand experience and had asked if anyone else had similar experiences. I was always terrified to sleep in that house. I kept many stuffed animals as far away from the edge of my bed as I could, hoping they would not fall off in the middle of the night and get taken by something strange, or even worse, possessed. As a teenager, I was walking down the wooded road in my neighborhood in the dark. There were no streetlights. This made it a pretty brave venture on its own, as the trees would make the road completely black. It would clear out onto the main highway, and here there were some tracks. I walked onto the tracks to sit and toss some rocks about. I enjoyed seeing the sparks at night when I struck the metal rail. I looked over at the pond that was next to the tracks and noticed there was a figure. I walked closer. My vision isn't perfect. I probably got this from my mother. I kept getting closer to the figure to make out if it was really a person or something else. What I saw terrified me more than anything I have seen in my life. As the figure became clearer, I saw it was massive in height. It had legs similar to a mythological god. Its upper body was gray, bare, and muscled. I bolted for the dark road leading back to where I lived immediately. I saw the thing jump across the pond and into the woods along the road. It was running too. I couldn't see it anymore, but I could hear it. I never stopped or slowed down until I got home. At one point, I was running so fast, it felt like my legs almost lifted off the ground, and I almost fell. When I was home and safe, my parents didn't know what was wrong with me. They had asked, but it was a while before I finally caught my breath. I was panting so hard, I felt like I was about to be ill. The next story is from Samantha in Scotland.